Hello, I'm Novelette Witt with Morgen Real Estate. Earlier this month, the South Bay Association of Realtors and the South Bay Council of Governments hosted the South Bay Housing Forum in Torrance. Some of the issues that was addressed are challenges that we're faced now regionally and of course throughout the state of California. Our guest today is McIntosh, Director of Community Development at the City of Manhattan Beach, and who was also one of the presenters at the Housing Forum. Hello, Anne. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Hello. Thank you for speaking with me.
One of the issues that was addressed was that ADUs and mixed use are possible solutions to help in alleviating the lack of housing supply. Is this possible, and is it considered good land use for the housing model?
Sure. So thanks for asking that question. Accessory dwelling units are a type of housing that for many, many years people rejected in communities like Manhattan Beach and in other suburban communities, because essentially they're adding units to existing single-family properties. And for a long time, homeowners would see this as an opportunity to create additional units by maybe converting a garage or a spare room and bringing additional households onto a single-family property. And the traditional suburban residential model wasn't favorable to that. And so people in communities would oppose that kind of housing. But about 25 years ago, the state of California adopted a law under the state housing law that required local governments to allow second units on properties, granny flats, granny units we often call them, and to allow them so that an older individual in a family or a child could stay on their family property and live independently, but on the same property. And so because the state law required it, local governments had to allow this kind of housing. Over the years, over the past 25 years or so, 30 years, the state has strengthened that law. And so now local governments have to allow property owners to even convert a garage and to not provide parking. The single-family homeowner can stay in their home. They can convert their garage to a second unit. It can be rented to anyone. And the local government agencies can't really restrict the ability for single-family property owners to do that. So that additional potential for housing is tremendous. If you imagine all of the single-family properties there are in these communities, if even half of them were to add those units, it's a way to provide additional affordable housing in communities.
And what about mixed use? How does it apply here?
So mixed use, again, 20 or 30 years ago, there weren't a lot of mixed use developments particularly in the West. It was a type of land use that you would see in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in older cities. But in California, it hadn't really been that popular. And lenders weren't favorable to lending on mixed-use developments because it was a different type of land use that they didn't understand. And so it took some pioneering developers to go into communities and to create these mixed-use developments. And when we say mixed-use, we mean either housing above commercial or housing adjacent to commercial but on the same property. And it took some experimenting and some attempts in different communities to provide this kind of housing, and it did catch on. One of the things that's tricky, though, is that small mixed-use developments that are isolated aren't as successful as those that you see where you have acres and acres of available land to create like an entire community of mixed use. So projects that you might see Rick Caruso building with the Grove or the Americana or his development out in Calabasas. In Redondo Beach, they just recently approved the South Bay Galleria to be converted to a mixed use development. So this is another way to provide additional housing units in a way that is less impactful to traditional residential neighborhoods because the commercial amenities, many of them are there. In some cases, employers are located nearby these mixed-use developments. So it's another way to provide housing in a way that we didn't see 20 or 30 years ago.
At the Housing Forum, you suggested that planning being done now in housing is not so much for us, but rather for the next generation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So this is one of my favorite things to talk about as a land use planner. What we often see, because we like to engage the community in dialogues about the vision for the future of the community. What do we want to see? What legacy do we want to leave for the next generation? And oftentimes, whether it's housing or transportation, people will often use their own experience as their basis for making recommendations. So people who have driven cars since they were 16 years old can't imagine a world where you wouldn't drive a car. People who have never taken a bus don't understand, well, why would somebody take a bus? I never took a bus. Similarly with housing, we typically are used to a housing type that is an individual living unit with a kitchen, with bedrooms, with a living room, with a separate parking space, maybe with a balcony or a yard, depending on whether it's an apartment or a home. And that model is wedged in our brains. People think that is what a housing unit is. In order to be housed, you have to have these things. And just like we've seen in newer office spaces where we have shared work environments, where we have people sharing cubicles and sharing a kitchen and even having a chef come in to help cook food for employees. I think we need to start thinking about other ways to provide shelter to people. It's happened in other countries long before it's happened here. So there's models such as co-housing, which you see in Denmark and the Netherlands, where people have their own private space, but they also share communal facilities like a kitchen that they would share together. That brings the cost of housing down because you're not providing every single amenity in every single unit. And especially for young people who are just getting into the world and just becoming independent, trying to get away from living at home, this is a model that I think would be very popular and affordable. And just like accessory dwelling units and mixed-use development 30 years ago when it was unimaginable, I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see housing builders come up with these creative new ways of providing shelter, especially for that gap.
Right. Thank you so much, Anne, for being here. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you so much.